Hello and welcome back to the channel, where once again it's time for another Sega Saturn review, where today we are revisiting a game that I did review several years back as one of the earliest games on my channel, that game being Cyber Speedway, otherwise known as Gran Chaser in Japan, a futuristic hovercraft style racing game that first saw release in Japan in May of 1995, making it one of the very oldest games on the system, a September 95 release in North America, and then finally a release in the PAL territory in December of the same year.
Clay Shaw's the name. No doubt you've seen me on the news blitz. I'm a sled jockey competing to represent Earth at the Cyber Speedway. You know how important the races are. It's more civilized than all-out war.
So Cyber Speedway is set at some point in the future where the civilizations of the universe have developed to such a point that war is no longer necessary for solving their conflicts. However, there are some more primitive civilizations still around, and this does include Earth, where they believe that war is still the solution, and this is preventing universal peace. So what the more advanced civilizations decide is that they're going to host an event called the Cyber Speedway, where instead of fighting in battles where millions will die, the planets will send their best racers to take part in competitive sled races where the disputes will be resolved by racing instead.
The best. My next race is the last test. When it's over, I'll be the driver representing Earth. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get down to the briefing room to meet with Nod and Colonel Dopp once more before the race starts. Wish me luck.
So once you hit the main menu, you'll see you've got a choice of story mode, free run mode, and options. When you head into options, you'll see you've got your button layout configuration, a choice between stereo and mono audio, testing the BGM and sound effects, and also checking the records for each course. If you decide to start with a single race or a time trial event, then you'll see that you've got a choice of 6 vehicles, and once you've unlocked them all, a total of 11 possible tracks. If you select story mode though, you will race through each of the courses in order instead, and you do not get to select your vehicle. Instead, you control the Terra sled for the whole time. So like always, I'm going to start with the visuals first, and I'll be perfectly honest because this for me is the weakest aspect of the game. With it being a May 1995 release, it was only the third racing game, if my sources are correct, to come out on the system, and as such, we've got a game that doesn't look particularly good and looks fairly similar, in my opinion, at least in terms of graphical quality, to Daytona USA, which isn't really a good thing. The game has a fair amount of glitchy pop-up on every course, enemy ships that will disappear and then reappear in front of you, slow down in busier or more complex parts of the courses, or indeed when several other ships are on screen. And as well as this, we've got vehicles that are not exactly the most inspired of designs. We've also got some less than stellar water effects, and of course those delightful mesh effect transparencies every time you fire a rocket, or when it explodes, or when you travel through dirt on certain courses too. Combine this with the incredibly basic menu presentation and the relatively poor still images that you'll see after each race depicting different characters, and you've got a game that isn't particularly impressive in the way that it looks or runs. What I will say though is that there is a substantial amount of variety as you travel from planet to planet to take part in the different races, with 5 of the planets having 2 different course layouts each. There is actually a decent amount of variation from course to course, which is certainly a positive point. The designs of each course as well are substantially different from one another. Some will have mines on the floor, whereas others will have icicle spikes or rocks obstructing you. So it isn't all negative in regards to the visuals.
Lap 2.
Moving on to the sound effects and music next, and for me it really depends on which version of the game you're playing here, because whilst the Japanese, North American and PAL releases all share the same sound effects within the races, which are actually relatively good with no major issues here, other than the slightly repetitive sounds for when you collide or use your boosters, the music differs between the regions. The North American release has music done by the rock band Bygone Dogs, but the Japanese and PAL releases have a soundtrack done by Next Tech's Koji Hiyama, which is considerably stronger in my opinion. In fact, I would go so far as to say that some of these tracks are some of the very strongest tunes that any racing game on the Saturn ever saw. One area of the sound that isn't so positive though is the quality of the speech that you will hear within all of the storyline sequences, as it has a slightly muffled quality to it, which is somewhat disappointing. But putting this to one side, Cyber Speedway is actually a fantastic sounding game, so what I'm gonna do is give you some samples of both the North American soundtrack and then the Japanese/PAL soundtracks, so you can make up your own mind on which one you think is superior. Moving on to the gameplay next, and Cyber Speedway is relatively simple to play and also somewhat unique. Whilst you have your standard accelerate and brake controls, you can also fire missiles once you collect them, and more importantly use the R and L buttons to boost to your right and left. This is an incredibly unique control element and makes the game stand out somewhat when put in comparison to other racing games which share a similar style, such as hi-octane or Wipeout. Similar to mastering the air brakes within Wipeout, mastering the right and left boost within Cyber Speedway is crucial to being successful in the game, especially if you're playing the story mode on the advanced difficulty where the CPU is much more aggressive and challenging, especially when you get onto the very last race. Another thing worth noting is that it isn't just you and your opponents on the courses, as you have obstacle vehicles as well, which, if I'm being truthful, I find more irritating than anything else. I do wonder why on earth these vehicles would be on a course when an intergalactic race is occurring. It actually doesn't make any sense at all to me, and it also reduces the performance of the game, so it really is a negative aspect as far as I'm concerned. Speaking of obstacles, your ship does have a shield meter, and if you take too much damage from obstacles and other ships, your ship will eventually retire from a race. But I will point out that this this has never happened to me in all of the races that I have ever played within this game. You also get a boost meter as well, and you can spam the boost as often as you want. Just take into account it will take a few seconds to recharge once it's emptied. In terms of how well the game actually plays, it is by no means the tightest or the most finessed game. In fact, the way it handles almost suits the visual presentation of the game, as it does feel somewhat rough and rugged and not exactly the most refined. What it is though, which is the most critical thing in my opinion, is that it is relatively enjoyable to play, as the CPU will make mistakes as well as you. Even if you hit the sides a fair amount of times or collide with other vehicles, you'll never be completely out of the race, and you will get opportunities to catch back up as long as you're capable of navigating the courses fairly well. The only exception, of course, being the very last race, which is considerably more difficult than any other race in the game. In regards to content and lifespan, you've got the story mode, which has 2 difficulties and sees you travelling from planet to planet whilst facing off against each planet's particular unique racer. You've also got fully voiced story segments in between the races where your mechanic will give you advice and also point out any upgrades that he has done to your vehicle. In regards to your vehicle, you can also change certain settings before each race, dependent on whether you want something more nimble with better acceleration or indeed something with a much higher top speed. What this does do is give the game a little bit of variety and also a small element of tactical play as well, but ultimately with the story mode not taking very long to play through, it is somewhat lacking. You've also got single player time trials and single races against the CPU as well, and more importantly, a 2-player split screen option, something that the Saturn's Daytona USA did not offer despite coming out at a very similar point in time, or indeed Ridge Racer or the slightly later Wipeout on the PlayStation as well. Whilst the 2-player mode is by no means anything to brag about in terms of how well it performs or the visual quality that it possesses, the fact that a fully 3D mid-1995 racing game had this option is impressive nonetheless, and would have been one of the very few things a Saturn owner could brag about to his PlayStation owning friend back in mid-1995. You've also got the 6 vehicles and the 11 courses that I previously mentioned, which is by no means a shabby amount for an early 3D racer, but the fact that the 1-player story mode only takes around 20 to 30 minutes to complete, even on the advanced difficulty, once you've got better at the game and with no unlockable content other than gaining access to the 11 tracks, the lifespan of the game isn't that great. So like always, that leaves me with my 2 final questions. Is Cyber Speedway still worth playing now, and does it have the quality to be in our PAL top 10 or even our worldwide Saturn top 10, or is it so bad that it enters my Saturn bottom 10? What I will say is that this game is underrated in my opinion. I think a lot of people criticize it heavily just because it isn't particularly good visually, but I think when you compare it to the original Wipeout, I still think it's a better game overall. I think it's more fun to play. I think the soundtrack, certainly on the PAL and Japanese release, is better than Wipeout 2, and the fact that it's got a 2-player split screen and a story mode counts even more in its favor. And if you're a fan of Wipeout style games, and I think you will get some enjoyment from Cyber Speedway, especially if you've never played it before. Now, in terms of whether it's got the quality to be in our PAL top 10 or our worldwide top 10, unfortunately not. Whilst it is actually a relatively enjoyable game, it isn't very good looking and it doesn't have much lifespan, and there are indeed better racing games on the system. It's by no means got the quality of a Sega Rally or a Wipeout 2097, that's for sure. But at the same time, it is nowhere near the bottom 10 either. It's probably much higher up the pecking order than it is much lower. But of course, these are just my thoughts and my thoughts alone. If yours differ, or indeed if you agree with me, let me know your thoughts down below. And like always, I'll be back in the near future with another Saturn review. Goodbye for now.